to Yale University for the Jesuit School on June 2022, last year, June 2022, with a Bachelor in Arts in International Studies in Spanish. I also have 2 minors or specializations, which would be in American Studies and philosophy. So if I use a lot of weird words, it's because of the philosophy training. I am here in Chile because I did my honors thesis on street art as a form of emancipatory journalism during the Estudio Social. So yeah, that's sort of how I ended up here. And yeah, I have a lot of mixed research experience with Latin American countries. I was a research assistant for Yale University's Central America Initiative. So I worked on a variety of projects, including a book on sort of changes in university autonomy in Nicaragua, a study on housing programs with Fundación Esperanza de México, and a project concerning organizations combating gender-based violence in Guatemala. Yeah, and since graduation, I was working on a farm. I'm really interested in local food autonomy, so I've been working on sort of like personal projects with relocalizing food systems in Seattle. And I've been working with some student-based groups on organizing around U.S. immigration policy. Yeah. So yeah, I'm part of the Fulbright Program. Do you want to add the caveat that none of the views of the Fulbright Program were represented in this presentation? So I'm part of the Fulbright Chile U.S. Student Program, specifically the Open Study Research Program. Chile basically has 2 programs for U.S. Citizens, which are the Open Study, which is a more general sort of type of research proposal, or the Open Science Award, which are obviously more geared towards the sciences. So there are 12 other scholars in the program. We're sort of all around Chile, but most people are in Santiago. There are a few of us here in the South. Yeah, and so Chile is a commissioned country, which means it has its own Fulbright Commission. So that sort of opens up a lot of opportunities for y'all as Chileans if you wanted to be in the Fulbright program. There are some really cool opportunities for Chilean folks to earn scholarships and study in the United States as well. Mine isn't connected towards getting a master's or a doctorate, but the ones from Chile to the United States are. So if any of you guys are interested in a master's or a doctorate through the Fulbright program, feel free to talk to me about it. I'm happy to help with your applications, and I'm like relatively good at sort of application writing and speaking that sort of language that you need to win scholarships. Yeah, so I'm here because my project is on decolonial journalism in Chile, investigating the practices of Indigenous media. I became incredibly interested in journalism and the way that it shapes our national narratives, our conceptions of reality during my experiences in the 2020 George Floyd protests. I don't know if that was something that y'all heard about here. Yeah, I'm really interested in subversive forms of journalism that sort of counter the dominant narratives that are being pushed about things, sort of as a world building aspect. So right here. Yeah, so let's talk about the education system in America. We'll do a little brief overview of how it's all structured from one's entire childhood. So education is compulsory for all children, but local and state laws sort of affect when compulsory education begins and when it ends. One thing that you'll notice during my talk is that the United States has a really messy mix of state and federal legislation, and sort of how our lives are all like wrapped into that. And that also is sort of one of the prime tensions between the 2 dominant parties in the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans. Yeah, so the levels are going to be preschool, which will be ages 2 to 5, elementary school, ages 5 to 10, middle school, ages 11 to 13, high school, ages 14 to 18, and then you have a few different routes that you can pursue post-high school, which would be universities or colleges, technical schools, community colleges. We'll go into all that a little bit later. And these ages are sort of like a rough estimate. Different for everybody, depending on personal circumstances, depending on state, depending on when your birthday is, kind of messy. Yeah. So there are three principal types of schooling. I imagine it's pretty similar here in Chile. Public education is like the vast majority of folks. That's about 90% of US students. Private schools are going to be about 10% of US students, and homeschooling is going to be about 3.4% of US students. Yeah, I don't know why these percentages don't add up to 100. I'm not as good, but yeah. So there are a few major differences between public and private education. So on the part of public, it doesn't require an application. You basically just have to fill out the relevant forms for your child or for yourself, depending on your age and whatnot. Private schools will require an application. I've never been part of a private school before college, so I don't fully know what that looks like. Yeah, and so public education is really subject to local, state, and federal laws for the most part. We'll get into sort of some of the intricacies there later. But private schools are beholden to some sort of standards about quality of education, but have a lot more leeway in terms of the amount of autonomy that the board of those schools have and the autonomy that the teachers have and their influence on curriculums. Part of this is because public schools are publicly funded. They get state government aid and local contributions, which can actually be really inequitable because, as I said before, different states have different legislation on their education, and local contributions generally is comprised of property taxes. So when you're in places that are generally populated by renters or people with lower incomes, you have lower funding for schools. So that's sort of a way that inequality is perpetuated through the US education system. Yeah, so private schools are public or privately funded by tuition. So generally people who go to private schools have a lot of money. Yeah, public schools are ostensibly secular. There's sort of like the whole separation of church and state thing in the United States. A lot of private schools, not all of them, have religious or ideological affiliations, mainly Catholic. I think there was a big movement in the early 20th century to sort of start a lot of Catholic schools up that are, yeah, pretty popular today. There are a lot in my hometown. Public schools are statistically more diverse in terms of income levels and racial and ethnic backgrounds. Private schools are historically and currently less diverse. There are also a lot of papers on the ways in which private institutions have sort of been like a way to propagate like racially segregated schooling, which is, yeah, very American. Yeah, so public schools are also more subject to being under-resourced. As I said before, the way that the funding is set up is basically makes it a lot harder for schools in lower income areas to get the proper resources. So therefore, private schools generally have better post-graduation. And that's also because private school students obviously have more money and have more resources to pay tutors to sort of like get ahead in some of the testing and whatnot that goes into going to university, get school counselors, things like that. Yeah. So private schools are pretty expensive. As you can see here on this fun little graph, private education is incredibly expensive. So these will all be annual tuition rates. Surprisingly, still less expensive than college. So that's fun. But yeah, as you can see, all private schools cost like $5,000 US to $30,000 US per year. Some of them have scholarships available for lower income kids, but that's sort of like a whole other thing. Yeah. So here's like a short little video on sort of the main differences between private and public school. I don't know if y'all can get sound on this, no?
Council for American Private Education, there are 33,619 private schools in the United States. There are around 5.1 million students enrolled in these.
Can y'all hear that?
It said that private schools are 10% of all school students in the U.S. The same sources state that there are 441,496 teachers working full-time in private school. As much as 79% of these schools have a religious affiliation, The Washington Post reported in 2016 that these schools are virtually all white, with non-white students only making up around 10% of students across the country. As for public schools, according to the National Center for Educational Statistics, 50.7 million public school students will be studying in one of them from pre-kindergarten to grade 12 in fall 2017. Teaching all those kids will be 3.2 million full-time teachers, which is a ratio of 16 students for every teacher. The ratio in private schools is 12 students for one teacher. One of the main differences of public schools is the mixed ethnicity of students. Public schools in America are made up of 24.4 million white kids, 13.6 million Hispanic students, 8 million Black students, 2.8 million Asian Pacific Islander students, 0.5 million American Indian Alaska Native students, and 1.5 million mixed race students. What about costs? Well, the government pays for public schools. In 2017 to 2018, it's projected that the budget for public schools will be $623.5 billion. This means that each student will cost an average of $12,300. Taxes will pay for this. Private schools are a different matter, and they are funded by tuition. Tuition costs will change depending on the school. For the year 2017 to 2018, the national average for private school tuition is $9,975 per year, which is $8,918 per year for elementary schooling and $13,524 per year for high school. The state of Vermont had the highest average, with high school being $31,543 per year on average. If you are looking for cheap private schooling, head to West Virginia, where the average cost for high school is currently $5,262. We should add that a handful of private schools cost around the $50,000 a year mark. So what do you get for your money besides pretty gardens and obviously top-notch facilities at a private school, and perhaps metal detectors and patrolling policemen in some wayward public school? Well, when it comes to the syllabi, public schools have to adhere to state standards, while private schools have much more flexibility. This is seen as getting a better and more diverse education. The good news for not so wealthy people is that high school graduation rates in public schools has gone up recently. It reached its highest during the Obama administration in 2015 at 83.2% of students graduating. At the same time, 95% of private school students graduate. According to the website College Admission, just about all of those private school graduates will attend the university, whereas only 49% of public school graduates will enter further education at college. If you want to get to an Ivy League university, there's no reason why you can't get in in public school. Top tier admissions tells us that roughly 25% of successful applicants to those top universities came from private schools and 60 to 70% from public schools. The rest were homeschooled. Private school does work for a lot of people. The richest man in the world, Bill Gates, went to a private prep school, but then he later dropped out of Harvard. On the other hand, Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg went to a public school. When researching for how private school graduates out-earn other kids in the future, most of the stories are about the UK and how private school there seems to create most of the UK's millionaires. The US playing field might be a bit more level. After all, Dr. Gray didn't go to private school. It seems in the US, if you actually get to university, it might not matter where you studied in high school in terms of making. At the same time, studies have found that being born with a silver spoon usually means you'll be passing that spoon on, and poorer folks with degrees don't usually jump off a class. Your background makes all the difference. A college degree, says one report, is no great people ladder. Why is this? There are a host of possibilities, from family resources during childhood and the place where one grew up, to the colleges that low-income students attend, said the report. Then you have rich folks that dropped out of high school, such as the billionaire Tumblr founder David Hart, who dropped out of high school at 15 years old. Joining him as a high school dropout is Facebook's former product manager, Michael. We'll base this show on the US today, as according to Globe's schools would be impossible. And so
Cool. Yeah. Yeah, the rest is sort of like a weird diatribe about upward mobility in the United States. Anyways, cool. So there are definitely a lot of politics involved with US schooling. One of those things is the recent advent of charter schools. So they started in 1988. I did go to a charter school from kindergarten through third grade. They're publicly funded, but they're operated independently, usually by boards, nonprofits, or companies, which I'm sure y'all can imagine. That's like a fun little neoliberal economic policy of the United States. Yeah, they make up 5% of public school attendance. And so there's more sort of like flexibility and autonomy for school boards and teachers. But there are also way fewer accountability measures, and schools are really subject to government scrutiny in this way. And once again, legislation for charter schools varies from state to state. So there's a lot of controversy around charter schools. Obviously, they're not all bad, not all good. It's a very complex issue. but they do have lower requirements generally for teacher training, which also includes lower labor protections for teachers. So this is something that has been said to be used in sort of a movement against teacher or so yeah, as y'all can see, they've really ramped up the amount of charter schools that we have in the recent years. Yeah, I'm kind of passionate about this. So if you guys want podcast recommendations about charter schools, let me know. Yeah, so there's some other current controversy in U.S. education as well. Right now, the United States is undergoing a lot of really horrifying anti-trans legislation. So a hot topic right now is education concerning gender and protections for trans and gender nonconforming kids. There's also this weird movement to ban critical race theory, or what conservatives think critical race theory is, which basically they think critical race theory is teaching people that slavery happened and whatnot, not the actual advent of what that academic theory means. So that's a huge controversy in a lot of states. And there's also, as I mentioned before, a lot of union busting efforts aimed at teachers' rights to organize. And yeah, a lot of that does happen on the charter school frontier. Yeah, so let's talk about higher education, since that's where we all are right now. So basically have four main options if you are going to continue with schooling after college or after after high school. So you can go to a state college or university. Usually these are 2 to 4 year programs, and these are funded and run by state and local governments. You can go to a private college or university. These are 4-year program, 2 to 4 year programs as well. They're privately run and funded, which is where I went. I went to a private Jesuit school. And then there's community colleges, which are usually 2-year programs. This will be your associate's degree. The aforementioned 2 would be a bachelor's degree usually. And they're publicly funded. They're a really good option. And then there's technical schooling, which teaches a trade like welding, electrical work, plumbing. Yeah, I have a lot of friends who do technical schooling as well. So the application process is kind of complex. You basically need like 6 main things. There'll be a high school transcript, so that's just your grades in high school. We have 2 main standardized tests. So different colleges have different requirements for which tests you need to take and what scores are the most favorable. So there's the ACT and the SAT. And as I mentioned before, you can sort of pay counselors to get classes on the SAT and ACT because, in my opinion, they aren't about pure intelligence. A lot of them are about sort of like thinking in a very specific way or having the right vocabulary to pass them. Yeah, and then you generally need letters of recommendation from mentors, teachers, people in your life who know you well. Extracurricular activities are really important to colleges. They sort of have this idea of like a well-rounded or holistic student. So that'll be sports, arts, music. For example, I played piano and I did a lot of community service clubs. You're going to need a financial plan, scholarships, because as we'll talk about in a little bit, college in the United States is incredibly expensive. Yeah, I had about 4 or 5 different scholarships working for me and still have student debt. So yeah, and then you do applications and pay the applicable fees. Most colleges will have fees to apply to them. You can get out of them there are certain programs if you're low income to get out of them, or if schools really want you, they might send you mail and be like, hey, we'll waive the application fee if you apply here. And yeah, so there's the Common App, which works for a lot of schools. So you can do like one application and then submit it to a lot of schools. And then a lot of schools also have their own application. So basically applying to college in the United States is just a matter of finding out the specificities that each different institution wants and sort of, yeah, figuring out how you want to go about that. Yeah, so college enrollment in the United States has like basically been on the upswing in the past century or so, which is cool. Also part of just the population rising. Yeah, and also a recent trend is that a lot of people are embarking upon higher education after college. So for master's, doctorates, different sort of types of professional degrees. This is for a mix of reasons, I presume. One of them being that you need higher and higher sort of qualifications to get jobs after college. It's like pretty hard to get a job after college, depending on the profession that you're going into. So it's sort of becoming a thing to get a master's or a doctorate to sort of qualify for different jobs. Yeah, let's talk about student debt. Yeah, so currently student debt collectively in the United States has reached 1.6 trillion US dollars. And 119 billion of these are in private student loans. So over 45 million people in the United States have student debts, which is interesting to consider that we have a population of about 300 million. And obviously a sector of that is children. So that's a pretty huge chunk of the American population who has student debts. So the average cost of a public university is going to be about $43,000 a year, and the average cost of a private institution is going to be about $54,000 a year. And repayment is something that we have to start embarking upon, I think 6 months after we graduate. I can't remember exactly. But yeah, as of the fourth quarter of 2019, 11.1% of student loan borrowers were 90 days or more delinquent or in default on their loans, which basically means they're behind on payments or they've been behind on payments for a certain period of time. Yeah, so 51% of students who graduated from the public four-year institution left with a federal debt averaging about $21,000 per person. And 53% of students graduating from a private institution have federal debt averaging more than $22,000 per person. So yeah, difficulties in repayment can do a lot to sort of hinder people's life paths after they graduate. Makes it harder to buy a home, to start a family, or find work in your preferred industry, especially because you need to start repaying those loans back immediately. I sort of joke about how most of my friends who've graduated are like still working in the restaurant industry because they have to pay our student loans back and whatnot, and it's hard to find jobs in our fields sometimes. Yeah, so college costs have really skyrocketed in the United States over the past decade. In 1968, a single year of college cost an average of $1,545 per year. And in 2020, a single year of college cost $29,000 per year. And this isn't just due to inflation. In 1965, the price was adjusted. If the 1965 price was adjusted for inflation, the average cost per year would be $12,000. So as you can see, we're like almost triple that. So we can't just chalk it up to inflation and whatnot. Yeah, as you can see, college costs have really skyrocketed since the 80s and 90s, since the Reagan administration. And so that also means that a lot of students suffer from food insecurity. For example, my school has like a food pantry, or people will sort of like sneak into private events to get meals. Like people do a lot of things to try to get food because we're food insecure because we're paying for college. And student debt is even greater among people who seek higher education after their bachelor's degrees. So as y'all can see, student loan debt among people with doctorate degrees and with master's degrees are incredibly high, ranging up to $200,000. And it also takes a very long time for people to repay loans. Associates are going to be 2-year degrees, bachelor's 4-year degrees, which is what I have at this moment. As you can see, it takes people at least their 20s, if not their 30s on to repay their loans. Yeah, and also defaulting on loans is pretty common. Y'all can see it's gone down a little bit since the 2008 recession, but still pretty high that, 15% of people can't repay their loans. Oops. Yeah, so what happens if you default on a loan? You might lose income. The companies that administer loans and the government may garnish your wages, basically steal your wages, and withhold tax refunds to collect on loans. So this makes it extra hard for people who are already food insecure or already don't have the proper employment to exist in the United States. Your credit score might decline, which makes it hard to get loans later in life, makes it really hard to buy a house, buy a car, start a business, any things that might be associated with upward mobility or with living a comfortable life in the United States. Often if you default on a loan, the loan is due in its entirety immediately. You can go from like a small monthly amount to immediately owing a couple $1,000s. And you might face legal action, which would be an extra economic burden because you'd have to hire a lawyer. Kind of evil. And there's also a lot of social inequity in loans, just because of the historical legacies of colonialism, slavery, and just patriarchal governance in the United States. A lot of people are already at a disadvantage educationally and economically in the United States. So, for example, women make up about 2/3 of student loan borrowers, and we're also still affected by lower pay compared to men. So, yeah, women are in the bulk of people who are struggling to pay back loans. Race is also a huge aspect of it. Black students are more likely to borrow compared to their white counterparts due to the way that generational wealth moves and the way that poverty is perpetuated in myriad ways in the United States. So Black and Latino students are more likely to default on their loans. And then, of course, class ties into all of this. We use an intersectional analysis. Lower income students are obviously more likely to have to borrow to do the high tuition costs. Yeah. So the American dream, let's talk about it. So basically, the American dream means a lot of things. It is sort of this cultural trope that we have in the United States that you can basically achieve anything you want by working hard, buckling down, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. That's a popular American saying. Yeah, and so obviously education is a really big part of our conception of the American dream, because education is sort of seen as this great equalizer, this way in which we can all sort of give ourselves the proper education to succeed in life. As we can see that has not been the most equitable thing. Yeah, so like all cultural tropes, the American dream means a ton of things and has, of course, undergone a ton of different transformations in the past few years, or in the past, however many years the United States has existed. So it has an interesting place in the popular imaginary and in the media. But sort of to distill it down a little bit, on an individual level, the American dream usually alludes to the idea of upward mobility according to personal merits. So there's sort of this idea that the United States is a meritocracy and that we can sort of achieve whatever we want by working hard. And on a national level or a political level, the ideal originally referred to these sort of abstract values of equality, justice, and democracy. Things that like supposedly underpin the United States governance. So basically, based on these two things, the American dream concept is sort of a synthesis of democracy as a political system and capitalism as an economic system. Yeah, there are different things that are associated with the American dream, sort of based on different surveys. It's a really hot topic in the media because people love to talk about whether the American dream is alive or dead. So yeah, one thing is upward mobility, the ability to change social classes based on your merits. Another huge aspect is home ownership, being able to own a home, which has gotten increasingly hard in the last 20, 30 years. The ability to accumulate wealth, to have savings, and to be able to retire. Freedom of choice in general, freedom of choice in your profession, freedom of choice in your lifestyle. Another aspect is that your goals are met through hard work and merit, sort of this idea that everyone in the United States, or everyone who has anything in the United States, has earned what they own. And then the last aspect would be entrepreneurship and exceptionalism. Entrepreneurship basically refers to being able to start a business, be your own boss, all that sort of stuff. And exceptionalism is sort of this idea that you are better than others, or you have, earned what you have through your exceptional merits or meritocracy stuff. But yeah, as we can see, all of the statistics that exist tell us that this idea of upward mobility maybe isn't as achievable. As we can see, sort of generationally, so the silent generation is like the oldest living or one of the oldest living generations in the United States right now. As we can see, lower and lower percentages of people are earning more than their parents. A really big part of upward mobility and the American dream myth is to sort of like be better off than your parents were. So as we can see that possibility has sort of been lowering in the past few years. And as we can see, this isn't just due to inflation. The growth of wages in the United States and the moves of inflation have not really matched up very well. And a really big part of this is wealth consolidation. So the top 1% or the top 0.1% in the United States own a huge share of the overall wealth. And that has only really been increasing in the past few years. As we can see that there is this pretty harsh upward trend from the 70s on, sort of like Nixon era, Reagan era on, which is, unsurprising. You can see that they were sort of at their height, and then we had FDR as a president who had a lot more of like equalizing policies. And so you can see that the wealth consolidation went down a bit, but then has since climbed back up to its previous state. There's just another fun graphic about how consolidated the wealth is in the United States. And there also are huge wage gaps between Black and white folks. So as y'all can see, upward mobility is harder for people who aren't of the white race. So this graph refers to sort of wage gaps between white and Black males. This one is for females, a little bit closer, but still, changing. Part of this is because of mass incarceration in the United States. I don't know how common this knowledge is, but the United States has the largest prison population in the entire world. And one thing that has been a really big part of Reagan era politics and Clinton, honestly, has been the growth of the mass incarceration industry, which is also highly privatized. So mass incarceration is also a really big contributing factor to the lack of wealth equality in the United States. So in conclusion, the American dream is a myth, but what does that mean? The word myth sort of has a lot of interesting connotations to it. I think the popular conception of myth is that something is untrue, not real, not achievable. But I want to sort of deepen our analysis of what that means a bit. In sort of like academic vocabulary, a myth refers to sort of a cultural trope that sort of perpetuates our ideals about a place. It sort of works as a cultural motor to keep up certain ideas, national ideas of national identity. So while upward mobility isn't impossible, it's a lot harder, but people still have a lot of belief in this American dream because this cultural myth is integral to our identities as people from the United States. So that's my presentation. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Hallie. Your presentation was very complete. And now we would like to give you some moments for you to ask questions. So you can raise your hand. People who are connected, they can write the question as well. And we are going to read them, and Hallie is going to answer them. Okay? Do you want to ask anything? Any questions? Not even one. Also.
Okay, thank you very much, Hallie, for your presentation. I was a little bit sad at the end of your presentation because I think there are a lot of people who have many good ideas about the United States. Yes. And you have presented something that is not so true. Yes. In the sense that they have the idea, they have this myth, they want to believe that this is the land of opportunities, the country of opportunities. And at one point that was true in the past, yes, but not these days. And do you think that there's a lot of frustration from people coming to the United States and then it was not the promised land? What's your view on that? Do you have the opportunity to meet at a school, in college, immigrants?
So for a lot of American natives, especially white folks, this just means upward mobility. But for a lot of immigrants, this can basically just mean the ability to work. As I'm sure you all know, the United States foreign policy has really devastated a lot of countries, especially in Central America, which is where most of the immigration comes from. So for a lot of people, there were some surveys that I read that people said yes, they did feel like they achieved the American dream because they were able to work and provide for their families and send money back home. So yeah, I just think it means a lot of things to a lot of different people, and whether you achieve it also has to do a lot with your cultural upbringing. I think that I would say most of the disenfranchisement with the American dream, in my personal opinion, does come from the white working class, and that's sort of where I think that a lot of Trumpist policies, or just like the rise of populists like Trump in general, has come from.
Over there.
That was just sort of my silly little thesis that I wrote at the end of undergrad. But yeah, my interest in equitable sociology, it's not my current research. My current research is totally unrelated in a formal sense. But I became really interested in equitable sociology because it happened right before sort of the George Floyd protests happened in the United States. And I'm really interested in media theory, in the way that especially popular movements are talked about in the press. So I just saw a lot of similarities between the way that the George Floyd movement happened and as the society happens. Sort of had like my own analysis on how those were portrayed in the media, in different ways in which like a lot of like revolutionary energy